Hi everyone, welcome back to Raising the Nuts. Have a couple announcements here before we get into today's video. First of all, thank you guys so much for the positive feedback on the last video we did with the little Andrew P. cheating scandal. We had a lot of fun making the video, and Joey Ingram actually played the video live on one of his investigation streams, and it was one of the highlights of this poker vlog, the history of this vlog, basically. It was just so much fun to see his reaction and to see everybody enjoying the video. So I'm happy that we made the video and we had a good time doing it. Second of all, we now have raisingthenuts.com up and running. On there you can find some show notes from both the podcast and from the YouTube videos. The podcast is now 11 episodes in. If you guys want to check it out, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can go over to Apple or any of the other podcast platforms. If you do like it, please drop us a line and let us know that you're enjoying the podcast. Leave a review and do all those things. So for today's video, what we're going to do is something a little different. It's going to be a little more educational in nature, less of a vlog. I'm not creating a training site. I'm not trying to sell coaching or anything like that. I just figured we'd do something a little different. And what happened was a vlog watcher named Paul reached out to me and asked if he could get one of the Raising the Nuts t-shirts that he saw on the channel. Jody was able to make one and send it out to him, and he wore it on a Stones live stream. This is obviously before the whole Mike Postle scandal. So what my plan is going to be is to go through some of the hands that Paul played while on the stream wearing the shirt and give my thoughts, my unfiltered thoughts. I wanted to make this video for a while, and I kept putting it off because I didn't want to miss out on some of the things that I'd be talking about. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to do one take as I watch the hand play out and give you all of my thoughts on the hand. And it's going to be unfiltered. I'm not going to have to edit anything. But I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm going to try to do one hand from the session each day this week. Hopefully I can get that done. It shouldn't take too long to get out. But hopefully you enjoy it, and let's get into the hand. All right, so this is my first time ever doing this, so bear with me. As you can see, we have Paul here in the Raising the Nuts shirt. The game is playing 1-3-6, so it's a 3-blind game, at least I think. It might just be 1-3 with a $6 straddle. Either way, the action is going to fold to Paul here in the +2 with 5-4 of diamonds. Now, this is going to be a little too wide for us to open. Paul does decide to open to $15. It's just going to be too wide. There are scenarios where it can be slightly better to open it, but it's probably long-term just going to be a losing play in general. Now let's think about some of the scenarios where it would be less of a losing play, and that would be if it was a really tight table where we knew that we could get either heads up or three ways to the flop, where we weren't going to get 3-bet a lot, where players were going to play passively post-flop and pretty predictably, and we can make really good decisions. The problem with 5-4 of diamonds here, first of all, we have the entire table left to act behind us, basically. And second of all, our reverse implied odds are pretty good in the fact that we're going to get overflushed at a fair amount. If any other players have a 5x or 4x hand, it's going to be dominating us. And additionally, it's just really hard to win money without showdown in multi-way pots with 5 high. So those are the things that are against it. Now, if I were playing in a play every hand challenge type game, what would be my strategy for playing this hand? Well, if I thought I had a table where it was more tight and passive, then I'd be more likely to just raise with it like Paul did here. If I was at a table where I thought we'd be seeing the flop 5, 6, 7 ways, I'd be more likely to limp in there and just try to minimize losses essentially. But as played, Paul does decide to raise it up, which again, with his image, what I would guess his image, we're only about 20 minutes into the session here, but I would assume by looking at him that you would expect him to be a little bit more on the tight side. So opening up here might get some respect and might be able to get you a heads up or 3 ways, in which case you can then win the pot uncontested more often. So he opens up to $15, and the player next to act, I forgot to mention this, and I had to edit this in, but I'm going to make it so that you cannot see our opponent's hole cards. We're going to play it just as if we're playing Paul, because in most scenarios you actually cannot see your opponent's hole cards, although Mike Postle may disagree about that. But in this scenario, we want to play just imagining we're in Paul's shoes, not knowing what our opponents have. So the player next to act looks like he has around $300, I think. I have to look at that a little bit further, $300 or $400, and he flat calls the 15, and it gets to Joe here in the small blind. Now, if we are actually sitting in Paul's shoes in this spot when we did decide to open, we have to recognize that Marley here is on the button. We assume Marley to be a winning player. Joe here in the small blind is what I would think would be a winning player. I don't know what Paul's preconceived notions of these players are, but this is just my thought process as I'm looking at this table. And the other players all seem to be relatively competent. Paul may have some history with them and know that they might be a little bit tighter, more willing to fold. Once the player behind us flatted, his name was Jimmy. Once he flats, and he has about $300. Now, it's important to remember that that's only 50 big blinds. So I'm not sure about his range. I do know that he had just lost a big pot before this, I believe, with queens against kings. But we don't really know what his flat calling range is going to be here. But if we were just to guess, usually it's going to be pocket pairs, Broadway type cards, and hands like that. Now, if he's a little more out of line, could be a lot wider range. We don't really know. It gets to Joe here in the small blind, and he puts in a 3-bet to $75. And once this happens, the other two players get out of the way. We're trying to decide what Joe's 3-bet range should be here, and he's facing a +2 open, so it's going to be a little bit tighter, and there's a call by somebody who has 300 or 400. So it's really hard to fit too many really wide 3-bets in his shoes in here, because the player who just calls can still have a pretty strong hand because he's only flatting a +2 open. And additionally, I would expect him to think that that Paul's open in the early position is going to be on the stronger side. So his range is going to look something like, ace king, ace queen, maybe ace jack suited, some other Broadway hands that might be 3-betting as well, like king queen suited, and then maybe I would say something like 10s plus, I'm guessing, maybe 9s plus, and then he's going to be flatting the rest of his continuing hands, I think. So once he decides to put in a 3-bet with that pretty strong range, and it gets back to us, we have to decide whether we should continue or not. And the arguments against continuing with this hand are, first of all, it's a very strong hand that we're likely to be facing. We are only about 125 big blinds effective, I think, given that we're playing in a 3-blind game. And the other concern, and you actually see Paul here, he looks over at Jimmy's stack to see how much Jimmy has behind, and that's a really valid reason to fold. Jimmy having $400, if we decide to flat and Jimmy decides to go with his hand, then we've just thrown away an extra $60 for no reason. Additionally, playing post-flop is going to be very difficult as we are now in very poor relative position to play post-flop because Joe, who's the pre-flop aggressor, is often going to be c-betting, and then we're going to be stuck between him and Jimmy, who has a stack that can jam, and now we can't continue with some of the weaker parts, weaker flops that we hit. Oftentimes we're going to hit maybe bottom pair or maybe middle pair or some kind of gut shot or something like that, where if we were heads up, we could just always call and continue. But when we have somebody behind us, we now have to worry that he's going to jam in and we're just going to be throwing away the flop c-bet as well. So given those two factors, I do like a fold here pre-flop. Generally, there's some other scenarios where if the positions were different, we would just easily call. For instance, had we been closing the action, or if we had been able to be in relative position, in a better relative position where the other two players will act before us on the flop. So I do like just a fold here, but Paul decides he's ready to gamble, so he's here. He came to play. Obviously, probably watches some of the play every hand videos, so he wasn't planning on folding, and he does decide to make the call. And Jimmy folds his hand. Once he folds his hand, I would expect him to have some like offsuit Broadway type combinations. I would expect most pocket pairs to probably continue, even though they're not getting like the best price, given his stack size behind, but it's probably close enough that they probably continue, and obviously his good hands are going to jam in. All right, so now we're heads up with, looks like $175 in the pot, and the flop comes down 9-8-7 with 2 spades, 1 club, which should favor our range. Our range should contain a lot more middling cards than Joe's range when he 3-bets from the small blind. Like I said, I think he's very likely to flat probably 7s and 8s for sure, and maybe even 9s. Hands like Jack-10 suited, I think, would probably flat a fair amount as well. And so the hands that hit this board really hard are not really in his 3-betting range, but they are in our calling range. So Joe is going to want to check a lot of his range here. And he does go ahead and check, so I'm not surprised. Now, when Joe checks, what that means to us, it doesn't really give us a lot of information if we think that he's going to check almost all his range, which he probably should. He should be checking some overpairs here because they aren't going to play very well on this flop. And he should also be checking his give-ups, so hands like ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, things like that. And then it's really hard for him to come up with too many strong hands. If he does have hands like Jack 10 and 9-10, those hands make for very good checks on this flop as well, obviously, which then protects your really strong hands. So he goes ahead and checks. And now what do we do with our hand? Now we're here in this spot with 5 high, which is probably it's probably the worst hand we probably get to in this spot. So I do like taking a stab at it here on the flop. What this will do is I think we get auto folds from those overcard hands. And then if he continues, it's very likely that he has overpairs. And he can also obviously have some flush draws as well. I don't know if we want to set up multiple streets here or not, but I think starting with a flop bet is the best idea. Setting up multiple streets actually isn't a bad idea either, because we don't have blockers, a hand that can continue and then fold later streets. A hand like Ace 10 makes sense for him to check call. Even a hand like Pocket 10s would be a check call in Joe's shoes as well, Pocket Jacks. And you can set up multiple bluffs, multiple street bluffs here on this texture. So obviously, additionally, with our strong hands, we're going to want to bet as well. If we do flop a strong hand on this board, we're going to want to start putting money in the pot to hopefully stack over pairs, and then obviously balance at the times that we do have bluffs. Additionally, this is a good hand to bluff, because if we do get jammed on or raised by Joe here, we just have an easy fold. Whereas a hand like, let's say King, Queen of Spades is a nice hand to have for an equity perspective, and does fine if it gets check raised. But it's worse to get check raised when you have that hand, I think, than it is to get check raised when you have 5-4, if that makes sense. So we go ahead and check back, though. Paul decides to check it back here and play a turn. Let this play out here for a second. So he checks back. The turn card comes a queen. And now Joe decides to put out a bet. And when Joe bets this turn, I think what he's saying is that he has a hand like aces, kings, ace, queen, king, queen. Those all make sense. Additionally, he could still have some of the very strong hands that checked, which would be like Jack 10 pretty much, would be the one that I would think. Pocket 9s if he did 3-bet that one as well. And then as far as bluffs go, he may decide to choose a hand like Ace 10 to start bluffing, or King 10 suited if he had check raised, or if he had 3-bet that pre-flop and decided not to bet. But once he bets, I think he's a little more weighted towards value than not. Now, actions over here on Paul, I think we just have a fold here. I don't think that we can really continue with a call. But Paul has other ideas here and decides to spring a raise here, which is a pretty interesting play. Not one that I usually break into my repertoire. But he puts out a raise, and he makes it $285, it looks like. Or $275 or $285, somewhere in that region, which leaves him approximately, looks like about $440 for the river card. The benefits to raising with this hand are that we don't have blockers, again, to those bluffing hands that Joe could have. Now, the turn didn't bring a backdoor flush draw or anything, so if I'm going to pause it here, if he did have a flush draw on the flop and decided to lead turn now with a hand like Ace Jack, I guess that could make sense. Maybe something like King Jack suited. We don't have any blockers to those hands. So from a bluffing perspective, there are some hands that Joe can continue with that we don't block that will then be auto folds on blank river cards. So it's not the worst hand to start bluffing with, I guess, and I appreciate the creativity that Paul showed here. So the river card is a blank, complete blank, the 3 of clubs. And when Joe checks it over to Paul, he decides he's going to go for it right away and jams in his remaining stack. So now let's think about what hands does Joe possibly have that can fold here. Now, if we do think that he has some of these auto folds like Ace 10, King 10, King Jack, Ace Jack, then it can make some sense. For him to have Ace Jack and King Jack, they would have to be of the spade variety, that 3-bet pre-flop and then check flop, which, could happen. And then additionally, I don't think that we're getting folds from Ace Queen and King Queen here very often. What are we representing? I think that almost all of our strong hands would be betting this flop. If we did flop a straight, if we flopped a set, if we flopped 2 pair, we'd be betting flop. I think that Joe would assume that hands like Queen 9, Queen 8, Queen 7 are not in our range. I guess we're repping Ace Queen exactly, which decided to check back flop, which makes sense, and then raise turn for value, which could have some merit. So we're really only repping Ace Queen for value here, I think. So what hand should Joe call with? Well, Joe has aces, Joe has kings, Joe has ace queen, he has king queen, and then, what hands does Joe think that we might be bluffing with? That gets a little tricky because this line is not a very common spot to find yourself in, and so in Joe's shoes, he's in a really tough spot here facing this jam because it's a very uncommon for opponents to bluff in this way, but it's also like what is Paul really representing? So Paul does decide to go for it, like I mentioned. Joe gives it a really long thought, and I think that he probably has to call with, he definitely has to call with kings and aces and has to call with ace queen, and then once he gets down to king queen, it gets a little tricky. He obviously has some auto folds if he does have hands like ace 10 and king 10 in his range. But yeah, this is where it gets a little tricky and you're not really sure what to do with the hand that's what essentially is in the middle of your range and you don't think your opponent has many bluffs. And so Joe eventually does decide to fold it after a good long tank. I will speed that ahead. And it turns out that Joe had king queen of clubs that we got him to lay down here with the suicide kamikaze bluff. Props to Paul. So this is an example of, it's going to be a losing play pre-flop to open this hand, I think, in the long run. Like I said earlier on, there's different measurements for how much of a losing play it is. And then to call three bet, you really have to work into a bunch of different scenarios where you win pots without showdown. And Paul found a creative way to do it. It's going to be a little more high variance. It's going to be a little tricky to do things like that. I'm not sure if he showed or not, but this is in the beginning of the session too, and it does send a good message to the rest of the table that you're going to get in there and splash around, and might get you some action on future hands. So nice hand to Paul, and I hope you guys enjoyed this analysis. Like I said, first time ever doing this, and I'm going to be back tomorrow with another one. And please let me know in the comments below if you like it, what your thoughts are on the hand. I tend to be a little bit of a perfectionist when it comes to analyzing hands. And so it's really hard for me to just sit down and go straight through this hand talking without cutting and editing and thinking about all the different things I want to add to the video. So I'm sure I missed out on a few things, but I got the video out there. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below. I will definitely respond to you, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for another one. Talk to you later. Say, oh.